My friend, our CPU archive being dry as a Ubisoft game, I decided on the behalf of the church to look at the i3-2130 we had in the storage. You may ask, why the CPU instead of any other one that we have that are more powerful and recent than the i3? My response is accessibility. With the price hikes of the new hardware that the gods are giving us, and the economic uncertainty, it is important to keep the church of the hardware accessible for every pocket. By providing modern performance data on various hardware, we're helping the ones that need it the most. Anyway, enough religion talk, let's go into this CPU. Launched in September 2011, the i3-2130 is just a little beefed up i3-2100. The speed was bumped from 3.1 to 3.4 GHz, making not a big difference performance-wise. This Sandy Bridge CPU is equipped with 2-core, hyper-threading, and 3MB of L3 cache. It has also integrated graphics, the Intel HD 2000. Unfortunately, it is only supporting DirectX 10.1 and OpenGL 3.1, making some games that I wanted to test not even open due to the lack of modern API. The original price for the CPU was $120 but most of the time it was an OEM PC for its low cost and its low power consumption, making it a good option for OEM. The church paid $5 on eBay, but it can probably be found for free with a whole OEM PC that somebody doesn't want anymore. For testing and for giving a chance to the CPU, it was paired with 16GB of RAM and an SSD. Also, because I didn't want to install the Intel stock cooler with the plastic pins that are breaking almost 50% of the time, I just used a usual water cooling, which is obviously overkill for this CPU. Let's start up with everyday usage. All of these Windows testing has been made with only integrated graphics of the CPU. The Windows installation took less than 10 minutes with the SSD, which is good compared to the time I tried to install Windows 10 on the Pentium 4. After that, I installed Chrome, Steam and other programs for testing the CPU, and all the installation were snappy. But when I tried to watch 4K 30fps video, there was a lot of stuttering and drop frames. The i3 will be able to decode 1080p 60fps videos with maybe Discord running in the background, but not much else. Next up is synthetic benchmark. They are not the best at showing everyday usage, but I think it's good for comparing quickly the performance of a CPU to others. In the built-in CPU bench of CPU-Z, compared to a i7-2600K, it was able to obtain a little bit less than half of the score of the i7 in multi-threaded workload and just a bit weaker in single-thread performance. In Cinebench R15, the CPU had a score of 288. Finally, for synthetic testing, I tried Prime 95 just to see the temperature that the CPU can go with the water cooler, and was only able to get 45 degrees Celsius. In the gaming section of the test, most of the games has been tested 2 times. One with the HD 2000 and the other with the GTX 1050 for maxing out the CPU without pairing it with something too unrealistic like a GTX 1080 Ti. Most people would pair the CPU with a GPU that doesn't require external power because, like I said before, the CPU was mostly an OEM offering and most of the pre-built doesn't offer 6-pin power connectors. Let's start this benchmark with CSGO as usual. For the setting of the HD 2000, it was set to the lowest setting with the lowest resolution I could get from the game. Well, any surprise, the results were awful. The integrated CPU got an average of 20 FPS and a 1% low of 7 FPS. But paired with the GTX 1050 at 1080p with competitive settings, the game was able to get 131 FPS on average and a 1% low of 60 FPS. Unfortunately, the game was stuttery due to the CPU struggling keeping a stable FPS. Limiting the FPS to 60 FPS would get rid of the stuttering. And obviously, with the HD 2000, the game was not playable. For GTA 5, with no surprise, the HD 2000 was coughing his lungs out. At 800 by 600 with the lowest settings, the iGPU got an average of 8 FPS with a 1% low of 5 FPS. The game was looking like a PS2 game with poor frame rate. For the GTX 1050, at 1080p with very high settings, the game ran great. It had some stutter at the beginning but got smooth after. The GPU got an average of 60 FPS with a 1% low of 37 FPS and was barely utilized compared to the CPU that was in a 95% utilization. This high CPU utilization compared to the GPU would be a trend in most of the game testing. World of Tanks was playable, but not enjoyable on the HG2000. It was like shoving up a fork in my eyeballs with the lowest settings and the lowest resolution. The game got an average of 35 FPS and a 1% low of 22 FPS, and the game didn't have any stutter. For the GTX 1050, most of the settings were bumped to maximum or ultra and was able to get just shy of 100 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 52 FPS. The gameplay didn't make my eyes bleed, and the game was smooth. When I tried Left 4 Dead 2, it was a breath of fresh air for the HG2000. The game was an acceptable resolution of 720p with the low settings and got an average of 45 FPS and a 1% low of 22 FPS. Even with a lot of zombies, the high GPU was able to keep a playable frame rate. The GTX 1050 with the highest settings and a 1080p resolution was able to achieve an average of 130 FPS and 52 FPS in the 1% low. Unfortunately, due to the lack of DirectX 11 and being weaker than the Munich agreement, the HG2000 was not able to be tested on all of the games the church wanted data on. That was the case for Minecraft. The HG2000 didn't support the version of OpenGL that the latest version of Minecraft was using. Using an older version of the game should solve the problem. For the GTX 1050, using a render distance of 6 chunks and a graphical setting of Fabulous, the game was playable. When mining and building, the game was in the low 200 FPS, but due to i3 struggling calculating new chunks, the FPS would tank if you explore the world a little bit, making it a stuttery mess. Monster Hunter was the real surprise of this benchmark. At the lowest setting, with a resolution of 1080p, the CPU and the GPU was maxed out most of the time. The frame time was consistent, the average FPS was low 60, and the low 1% was above 30. I would have not think that the CPU would keep up. Another game that impressed me that it even launched was called Warzone. With the CPU always at 100% utilization, the game was able to get an average of 26 FPS and a 1% low of a merely 1 FPS. With the results, I would not call it playable, but impressive that the game launched. Going into the emulation segment, I started Project 64 with only the HD2000. The game was running at full speed without any hiccups. If you want to play any console below the N64 or the DS, the little HD2000 will probably not have any trouble playing the games at full speed. But it was not the case with the GameCube with Dolphin. The game was running most of the time at half speed, rarely going into full speed. With the GTX 1050 and the Vulkan renderer, the game was running way better, being almost always at full speed. PS2 emulation was a deception. Due to the lack of AVX2 instruction set, I had to use the SSE4 QT fork of the emulator. With the iGPU, the game was running most of the time below 60% speed, and for the GTX 1050, the game was running just above 80% speed, sometimes getting full speed. The results make it clear that PS2 emulation on the i3 2130 is not an option. For curiosity, I also tried RPCS3 and the footage says everything. Lastly, here are some games that I tested on the i3 2130. Sometime, only the GTX 1050 will be in the benchmark, because the game didn't launch on the HD 2000, and in some cases, only the HD 2000 is tested, because the GTX 1050 would not make a huge improvement in performance. The i3-2130 was a mixed bag of good and bad surprise. I would say that for desktop use and schoolwork, the i3 is enough for these tasks. For gaming, without pair with a GPU, the CPU would be enough for older titles, 2D games, and light emulation. But architectures rises and fall, some even burn, like Civilization. Sandy Bridge is not immune to that. They are provided by the gods from the prayers that we send, and mostly money. Unfortunately, these past years they started to hunger for more and more of that green banknotes that are growing in the wallets. Their gluttony will one day bite them back. For the moment, we need to find peace in older hardware. It would be interesting if the church will do a complete Sandy Bridge analysis, if we can still use them in these hard times. My friend, if the church want any other game tested, I will be happy to send the results. May the gods and their drivers be merciful. My regards, Nick.